Welcome everyone. This is Chris Lindgren with Mass Bio. We have a few definitions up for you as we give a little time for attendees to populate into the webinar. So take a look at those if you would, just to get oriented. And what else did I want to say? I'd like to thank our speakers and our regulatory co-chairs for their generosity today for doing this forum. And just a quick reminder to please use the Q&A function. If you have a question, you're also free to use the chat, but that's more to just chat amongst yourselves or with us. But our moderator will be looking at the Q&A, so please use that function. Just click on it, and then you can enter a question. Let's see. And with that, because we have a lot to cover this morning, I'd like to turn this webinar over to our moderator, Tim Pauly of Panelists, who's calling in from Germany, for our intros and for our panel discussion. And I'll turn it over to you now, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you can all hear me well. Welcome to all of you to our today's webinar about accelerating digital information and transformation in regulatory affairs. My name is Tim Pauly. I'm heading the Global Regulatory Informatics and Operations Group at Panelists. And this is a topic that is kind of on my heart since many years. I'm very happy that we have a fantastic panel today to talk about this. I'm coming from regulatory operations. So that's my background, doing all these fancy information management and electronic submission stuff. But let's do a quick reality check. So our upper management, I mean, they're using their phones and Siri and Alexa, and it's kind of very smart systems, and assume that's the same kind of things that we are applying to our systems. When I ask my regulatory colleagues, scientists, it's kind of the ECDD nerds, the technical nerds in regulatory operations, handling all these kind of electronic submission stuff. When talking about health authorities, the submission is just a click away. But what we are actually doing is a lot of manual data entry with outdated technologies. When looking at regulatory affairs, there are a lot of challenges, enough challenges that we need to deal with. There are more and more innovative new strategies, new clinical endpoints that we have to deal with. There's a lot of more data from different data sources, for example, devices and wearables, and Jennifer will talk a bit about this later on. There's a pressure for faster time to market, especially when we're talking about COVID-19 right now and the vaccine, the race to get a vaccine. We are facing more and more compliance challenges worldwide, a lot of regional and local requirements that we have to deal with. There are more and more reporting demands. And last but not least, also an overall budget and resource constraints. If not to say a lot of budget pressure on regulatory affairs. Today we'll touch a couple of these topics and see how digital innovative technologies can help us solving these challenges. So how does digital transformation affect us and our domain in regulatory affairs? In the very first version of the slide, I called it the human problem, but kind of the colleague said, like, that's maybe not the right wording. It's not that we are the problem, but we are interacting with such technologies. We are impacted. So we are an important factor when implementing, when talking about digital transformation and talking about new innovative technologies. And that's something that's very often forgotten, because we are so excited about new technologies. But when talking about this accelerating digital information, that's not about replacing human intelligence. It's actually complementing what we are doing with our human intelligence. It's about supporting the decision-making process. It's about handling large amounts of information, and it's about identifying patterns in data that we are maybe not able to see with human eyes. And Scott will talk a bit about this in his presentation later. So actually, this is all in an area where we are not really risking to lose jobs. Nevertheless, I'm pretty sure our roles will change a bit. We'll have different roles in this combination between our expertise, our human intelligence, and new technology, smarter systems. I'm very happy that Andrew will talk about this later on. Yeah, we have a fantastic panelists today, and I want to give them a lot of the time to give their perspective on this topic. We're starting with Jennifer Panagoulias, Vice President, Regulatory Affairs at Wave Life Sciences. Jennifer will talk about the transformation in the drug development process in clinical and regulatory, and how agencies are supporting this change. Then Scott will talk. Scott Cleave, Vice President, Regulatory Operations and Compliance at Bluebird Bio. He will talk about the shift from data tracking to predictive analysis and how structured data will change our decision-making process. And last but not least, I'm happy that Andrew Fried is joining our panel. He's a life science industry leader at IBM. He's in this business for quite a long time, and he's talking about drivers, trends, and solutions, how digital innovation impacts the life science industry, and also with a very current perspective on how COVID-19 can change the acceptance of new technologies. So I'm very happy to hand over to Jennifer, our first speaker. Please, Jennifer, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Panagoulias, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Wave Life Sciences. And Wave is a genetics medicine company that develops stereopure antisense oligonucleotides for the treatment of rare neurological diseases. And we have several clinical stage programs ongoing right now. Next slide. So what I wanted to talk to you about today was the regulatory efforts to utilize digital innovation in the development landscape. And as you may know, FDA has made a commitment to advancing regulatory science in an effort to develop tools and approaches to assessing the safety and efficacy of drugs. And part of that effort is to have a digital health innovation action plan. So they see the need as well for utilizing digital technologies within the development landscape. And what I'm showing here is a quote from the former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb on the ability of such tools to inform the regulatory process. And in particular, it provides a good example of how digital tools are envisioned not just for monitoring of patients, but how the information from that monitoring can actually inform product labeling. And here he makes the comment about being able to use smartphone cameras or facial recognition software to classify pain. And that could be an important component in product labeling. And so we have the ability not just to use the technology, but to inform physicians of results based on these tools. Next slide. I just want to pause here. Chris, do we have any issue with the sound?
No, we're fine. I just had one attendee who was having issues, so I think everyone else is fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Want to check in. As you also know, there were many tools and initiatives that were included in 21st Century Cures, which was enacted in 2016 with the intention of advancing development and innovating, especially in the area of rare disease where there was still significant unmet medical need. And with that, there's been some talk about having a Cures 2.0 legislation to continue in this effort. And in fact, there was a white paper that was released just a few weeks ago by the original sponsors of Cures, Representatives DeGette and Upton. And they outline some of the key initiatives they think should be undertaken if there is to be a Cures 2.0 bill. One of the key aspects that they commented on was the need for FDA to have a coordinated approach on digital. And in particular, what they say is they see value in CBER, CDER, and CDRH coordinating efforts to foster use of digital health technology. And specifically, what they'd like to see is agency guidance that outlines how digital endpoints could be used as part of regulatory review, importantly on how they should be qualified and validated, and how these digital health technologies could provide patient-focused development products, development information on these products. And I think that's really key, since FDA has had a huge initiative under PDUFA 6 and Cures to seek patient experience data as part of the regulatory process. And so such tools to monitor patients may provide important information on how the patient functions and feels, and what their experience is like in living with their disease. Next slide. So with that in mind, I'm going to provide two examples of how digital innovation can impact the regulatory development landscape and advanced regulatory science. The first I'm showing here is a wearable device. It's not unlike a Fitbit, although it does a little bit more, but it's a monitor that can be worn on the ankle and wrist to measure information about walking. And it was first utilized in patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And if you're familiar with DMD, you know that patients lose muscle function that impacts their walking ability and leads to wheelchair dependence, often at a very early age. So many trials, and there's been a large number, if you look on ct.gov, you may see upwards of 17 trials actively enrolling patients with DMD. And many of them use performance-based walking tests, where the patients come into the clinic at distinct time points, and they have to walk down a corridor and have their ambulation measured. And so it really relies on the patient going to the clinic and really performing well at that time, even though they might have traveled a long distance or don't feel well that day. And so you can see how, especially in the COVID era, when you are limited to clinic visits, you may be missing data if they can't actually show up at the clinic. So in this scenario, you have a discrete visit, but when the patient goes home in a setting where they're more comfortable, they may be ambulating throughout the day, and you can collect a lot of information on them. And so this device was created to allow a continuous monitoring of the patient's walking ability, really in a comfortable environment. And the device is docked at night. Information is collected from that prior day. It gets uploaded to a cloud-based environment, and it can be monitored and analyzed throughout the study. And so this results in continuous measurement and monitoring that's not as subject to missing data by missed visits or poor performance on the part of the patient. And in fact, the company that developed this device had it qualified with the European Medicines Agency as a secondary endpoint to measure stride velocity, or essentially different aspect of walking, in registrational trials in DMD. And the EMA, in fact, acknowledged the utility here and liked it so much that they included it as a potential endpoint in their guidance on development of therapeutics for DMD. And so they, as a regulatory agency, have really embraced this as a means to collect data and not lose key milestones. And this same group is undergoing qualification of the wearable with FDA. Next slide. The second example I'm going to provide covers sponsor assessment through digital platforms. And this one is a system that centrally monitors trial data to really get a real-time assessment of trial operation and performance. And I think this is especially critical in the rare disease setting for pivotal trials, where you may only have 2 trials that comprise your entire clinical development program. And so understanding the interpretability of your data set and issues and risks that may be presenting, especially with respect to missing data or non-compliance, is really helpful. And this dashboard shows by site a scorecard on a real-time basis of missing data and anomalies in the data based on central monitoring that may suggest a compliance issue. And so it allows an earlier assessment of issues at the site level. And this approach was endorsed by FDA in their guidance document on centralized monitoring platforms that augment the field-based monitoring approach that's undertaken by clinical trial monitors. And I think that highlights what Tim said, where we're still utilizing the human factor, but in this example, we may be deploying monitors more effectively based on what we've learned at the central level, because we can identify systemic issues across the trial that may need to be urgently addressed. And so then you can send out your field-based monitors to address this more readily and in an informed way, so that we don't just rely on the monitor to uncover all of the issues. Again, this makes me think about FDA's recent COVID-related clinical trial guidances, where they've highlighted the need to have strategies to centrally monitor when you can't remote monitor because of the trial being suspended or travel issues or whatnot. So this is another important innovative tool that helps us understand from the regulatory perspective, is our trial still going to be adequate? Is it going to deliver the information that we think it will? So in sum, these tools provide opportunities to innovate in the regulatory environment and advance regulatory science as potential tools to improve interpretability and review of data, and thus facilitate more rapid development. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very interesting. Before going to the next speaker, I just want to highlight again what Chris already mentioned. Please feel free to post your questions at any time during the presentations in the Q&A window, and we'll pick it up later in this session. After the presentations, we have plenty of time available to pick up your questions. With that, I want to hand over to Scott. Scott, the stage is yours.
Great, thanks, Tim. So I'm Scott Cleve. I lead the Regulatory Operations and Compliance Group at Bluebird Bio. If you don't know about Bluebird, we're a gene therapy company currently focusing on gene therapies in oncology and severe genetic disease. And what I'm going to tie today is my discussion on digital tools and data to a lot of the concepts that Jennifer spoke about and Tim at the beginning. So that's going to be the focus. Next slide, Tim. So as we look at the technology that becomes available to us in regulatory, our thought moves to how do we help our regulatory strategists with their jobs? And sort of the holy grail of this is how can we start using AI and predictive analysis to understand the success of our studies, the success of regulatory approvals in the future. But right now, I think we're still at the early stages of investigating what we can do with our data and utilizing digital tools. And it's very simply in a three-step process. So first, if we look at the inputs, and these are the data sources that are coming into regulatory. So in the past, it was really, what's our approval date? And that was the key date that triggered all these other activities in the organization. But that's rapidly growing in regulatory. Now we have our regulatory correspondence, we have feedback, we have questions and answers that we're trying to catalog and trend. So as we move to other regions globally, can we reuse information to answer their questions, or can we prepare our dossiers for those questions to reduce some of the questions and answers that come back? With the emerging data requirements such as XEVMPD or IDMP, now regulatory is being looked at as a steward for managing data that's coming from the company to the health authority and what those expectations are. And this is leading to additional requirements for regulatory operations and regulatory professionals to have some data capabilities that help us do our jobs, which is leading to the second point of processing. How do we process all of this additional data, the data requirements, the additional sources of data and information that our regulatory professionals are using, which is now allowing us to explore digital technology. And at the beginning, that's really focused on kind of robotic process automation. So how do we take data from one system to another and do that quickly and efficiently? Today, most of us do that manually, whether we do it internally or we outsource this to have someone else do it, which then requires a set of QC to make sure it was captured correctly. And if we look at using automation to do this, we can do it in a more quick and efficient manner. And when we move from robotic process automation, we move into something like natural language processing. So can we take the information in unstructured formats and digitize it and make it granular so that we can use that information to feed into machine learning or AI that allows us to produce outcomes, which leads us to the last part of this 3-box scenario, what are the outcomes that our regulatory strategists and professionals need to make their decisions? And this is what Tim touched on in his last slide of there's a human element here of the information coming from our data, coming from these digital tools needs to be user-friendly. It needs to be value added to what the regulatory professionals need to build strategy, to contribute to development plans, and to help our negotiations with the health authorities to get our products on market. Next slide, Tim. So what's the current state? And a lot of what we're doing today is trying to figure out what data are useful for regulatory strategy, because there's a lot of it. So how do we differentiate regulatory data from scientific data? What's specific to a regulatory strategist's job and their needs to build a regulatory strategy, to look at competitor information and differentiate our products from others when we negotiate with the health authority, and also when we're discussing with our commercial colleagues? How are we looking at new regulatory and scientific trends that drive regulatory strategy and our decision making? So what's happening at health authorities that is changing guidance, that's changing regulation, that is often data driven nowadays, that changes how we have to analyze information internally or from external sources in order to build our regulatory strategy and have effective discussions with the regulators? How do we digitize past experience and decisions? And now this is a tough one because this is really the human element. And we pay a lot of money and we depend on regulatory strategists that have years of experience with different products, with different regulators. But how can we start to digitize this information and put it in context when we're trying to make data-driven decisions? And I think this is where we try to collect a digital repository of information, not only our scientific data, our competitive data, our regulatory data, in order to have a robust set of information that the reg strategists can rely on to drive their decision making. And then the last one's difficult too, because we're trying to figure out how transferable is regulatory data and decisions from one therapeutic area to another or one product to another. We know it's not apples to apples in most cases. So how do we distinguish and differentiate data when we're trying to use it and apply it to regulatory strategy and regulatory decision making? One click, Tim. But as we know, there's several obstacles right now. Our primary obstacle is our data is mainly unstructured today. It sits in documents and it sits in PDF documents mostly. So how do we work to build our data and information in a structured manner? So whether that's structured authoring, it's in data sets, which we're doing in the clinical realm, but how do we start thinking about developing data in a structured format so we don't have to repurpose and take unstructured data into a structured format, which takes a lot of time, resource, and money to do in the future. If we can do this at the beginning, it helps us to build this into our processes and utilize it in a quicker fashion for the reg strategists to use. How do we then address the third point, which is the contextual information in documents? So when we're trying to build a structured story of data, we need some context to it so we know how one piece of data relates to the other. And how do we build tools that are able to assess documents and keep that context so we're able to understand the data point in relation to how it's being analyzed and reviewed in our documentation. If we just take it as a standalone data point, we may be interpreting it incorrectly because we don't have that additional context that's needed. We also have a knowledge gap for tools and technology within regulatory. I think some of our tools, while they're getting better over the years, we're still a little behind in having everybody in the regulatory team adept with using the new technology. From a technology standpoint, how do we make it easy for our strategists and others to use? But we also have to help them flatten the curve, to continue to use that term in a different context, with their technical aptitude. And then, from a regulatory perspective, data governance, data modeling, data stewardship are fairly new skills to regulatory. I think over the last 5 to 10 years, things like EVMPD, SPL to some degree, IDMP are starting to drive these skills into regulatory, but they aren't skills that we've necessarily recruited for or built in our groups. So we have to start thinking in that lens within regulatory and then throughout the organization. So we think data first. Next slide, Tim. So what now? Thinking about what's currently happening and where we want to go. And going back to the first picture and thinking through this, in terms of input, what's important to us? And first, it's really data. It's taking a data focus to what we're doing. And when we're building systems, when we're building process, to think about the data elements that either drive the process or will be an output to the process. And that includes looking at our design, development of systems, processes, how we're going to innovate, how we're going to start to pilot and use digital technology, and really having that data piece in mind. So we're not doing a lot of rework to clean our data and to structure it so it can be processed by emerging technologies. Next click, Tim. So then processing. How do we use automation, machine learning, natural language processing, and AI in our organization? We know that pool of data is growing and it's going to continue to grow. The examples that Jennifer identified in terms of how we're using wearables, how the regulators are looking at the implementation and employment of digital technologies are going to continue to just add to this data pool that we have to then process, analyze, consume. And that's becoming a larger job for our regulatory professionals when they're trying to build strategy, when they're trying to talk to development teams. We have to be able to synthesize that in a format to where they can identify what's important to them and then use it for their negotiations, whether they're internal to the organization or external to the organization. And a lot of this comes down to, we need specific business use cases. We have to partner with the end users to understand what they need, and then we can see what digital tools we can leverage to fulfill their requests and to test these business cases in the future. Next click, Tim. So then output, and going back to my previous statement, it's understanding what our stakeholders need to make their decisions, to build regulatory strategy, to negotiate with health authorities, to partner with clinical and other departments within the organization, and to then employ the data and technology to deliver this output and outcomes to them so it makes their job easier. And that's really what we're in the business of, is how do we do this in an efficient way? How do we do this in a mindful way so that our end users have something that's valuable to them when we employ technology and data for the organization? And this is an emerging area. I think there's some companies that have been doing a little bit more. I think Merck has really dove into digital and driven some really ambitious technology to help the regulatory groups. And I look forward to seeing where we can drive a data-driven focus for our regulatory professionals and help them be successful with developing our regulatory strategy and bringing really helpful products to patients globally. So Tim, I think that wraps up my talk, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Scott. Very interesting about this kind of shift in how to deal with data and how this can improve our decision-making process. The last speaker on the panel, we have Andrew. Andrew will take a bit of a different perspective, more from a technology provider. And after Andrew, we have time for questions. So again, encouraging you to post your questions in the Q&A section. We're happy to pick them up afterwards. But first, Andrew, please.
Thanks, Tim, and to the other panelists. Thank you very much. Just a very brief introduction. I'm Andrew Freed. I am IBM's Healthcare and Life Sciences Leader for Europe. I've got this one slide, that's only one slide, and hopefully I'll take 10 minutes and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. In terms of my background, the accent, I'm Australian. You may have guessed that, you may not have. I've got a very international background in terms of my experience. I've spent 10 years in Japan, working there in a life sciences role. 5 years in China. I spent, prior to coming to Europe in 2015, I was IBM's life sciences leader for China. One of my clients there was one of the largest vaccine companies of the world, actually. Who are obviously currently working around solutions for this COVID crisis at the moment. And as I said, I've been in Europe for the last 5 years. I'm based in London. So let me just frame the discussion here by a couple of overall comments. And that one is, when we tend to look at technology, we think of some underlying things, and we think of power, we think of storage, and we think of the movement of data. So power continues to go up in terms of processing capacity. There's no end in sight. Quantum's a far, end of the scale of where we're sort of moving towards, and that's already coming into fruition at the moment. So you can already hop on to many different websites and utilize the power of quantum at the moment, early stages. Storage, the cost of storage goes down. That's been a dramatic shift over the last couple of decades. And the movement of data is getting easier and easier. And if we sort of shift attention a little bit into the sciences, into life sciences and healthcare, then we think about technology and its interrelationship with science. And this is a symbiotic relationship. The technology innovates, the science innovates, the technology innovates. But there's a third leg of the stool, and the third leg of the stool is really collaboration. And if you think about where we are today in this environment with COVID, then it's the collaboration that's really the thing that's changing. The technology, the science isn't necessarily changing at the moment, but the degree of collaboration that is taking place is changing. So what are we seeing in terms of COVID-19 at the moment? Firstly, I'll just recommend if you have a look, if you want to know a little bit more about how long it will take to develop a vaccine, there was a very good article that was in the New York Times. I'm not a shareholder, but it was on April the 30th, and it was basically, how long will a vaccine take? I suggested you take some time after this to have a look for that article. I think it's free access, some fantastic graphics about the time it has previously taken to develop a vaccine and what needs to change to get a vaccine in the next 12 to 18 months if we're lucky. Okay, so have a look at that if you can. So I talked about collaboration, and we could talk about collaboration tools. That's another discussion that we could have. But I just want to reference, some of the changes that we're taking place at the moment, and what will lead to an enormous shift in further acceptance around the use of digital data, the use of artificial intelligence. So if you think, I'm going to reference a particular provider, healthcare provider in North America, and they say that pre-COVID, 2% of their consultations were virtual, okay? Currently, that number is 60%. What will happen post-COVID? Not sure, but it's unlikely we're ever going to go back to that old environment. I think that's a very good demonstration of the shift that's occurred in a very short and very rapid period of time. It proves that we can adapt, and we can adapt very quickly. So COVID is leading us to change the way we do things. When you have a look at that article on the New York Times, you'll see the compression that's needed, not just in the research component, but the way in which trials are run, compressing that, the way in which the data is submitted to the regulatory authorities, and the way in which manufacturing will need to be both built and built out. So these are all sort of kind of things that are changing. So what's behind it? Big data. Scott talked a lot about big data and how we're leveraging big data, and we can't do that without the tools that we have, without using the tools that we have. And these tools in general exist today. What else is driving it? Well, we have an aging population, so we knew about that before the crisis, but that basically means that our solutions that we need to put in place, there need to be outcome-based solutions, we need to monitor those solutions, and for us to succeed as a society, then we have to get that right. And value-based care. Now, Jennifer talked a lot about the one device there for muscular dystrophy, but there are many devices, and I'm sure Jennifer sort of referenced that as only one of many that are out there. And, these will proliferate there, and their acceptance will proliferate as well. So that's one of the key changes. So in terms of the emerging trends, I tried to summarize these into these three areas, right? So one was the investment in supply chain integrity. And this is supply chain in terms of stuff coming into the manufacturing, but stuff leaving manufacturing, the vaccines, as we're particularly talking about around COVID, and how they attract and trace as they get to patients. This is going to be an enormous task, and it's all about risk minimization and the monitoring tools. Once again, they exist, but they will need to play a role in that particular case. Improving the patient digital experience. I'll put that down there as the second one there, because we are living in a consumer world where the consumers have got mobile phones with them all the time. Jennifer referenced her device, that collecting device, and she referenced it to a consumer device, a Fitbit. This is normal. So the way in which we collect data is in a consumer-friendly way. That's an enormous shift, and the technology works. So that's another shift. If you went back 10 years ago or 15 years ago, then you would have had trouble. You would have trouble uploading your software on your mobile phone, and changing from, say, one environment, say an Android environment, to an Apple environment. That was all headaches and stress, and a lot of that's all gone away today. So the consumer understands that. So we need to have solutions that are basically for the consumer, meeting their expectations. So, and the final thing is around these platforms, and that's also accelerating the digital transformation. When I talked about the stool before, the three legs: technology, science, and collaboration. Well, collaboration is the key, and that's and the tools that are enabling that are what we're seeing. So what are the technology solutions? I'll just briefly go through these. I want to leave plenty of time for question and answers. Internet of Things is driving everything. 5G, edge computing. I mean, there's a whole host of stuff there around about that. But my view is that 5G is a game changer. It will enable the Internet of Things for us to collect data in almost real time, to monitor patients, to use the data to recommend things such as, whether it's a dosage or whatever a person is taking. So that's an enormous shift that we're currently in the process of seeing. High performance computing, that's becoming, and I mentioned earlier, it's becoming more accessible. We play in that particular space. We play in all these spaces, does IBM, but we have the world's fastest computer. We've opened that up. I mean, this is a classic example of what COVID is doing, right? So we've opened up our, mainframe. It's the Summit computer at Oak Ridge to people that want to use that for research purposes. So those sort of things are taking place. one of the things that I prefaced a lot of the discussion, and Scott mentioned it as well, and also Tim, but it's artificial intelligence, and it relates to machine learning, it relates to clinical development. It actually, from now on, when I give this presentation, I'm going to take away the AI. Artificial intelligence is infused in everything, whether it's the high performance computing, the way that we use the Internet of Things, whether it's around machine learning, clinical development. It is part of the process. And you and I, we see it when we sort of, do the chatbots now. You're seeing them everywhere, right? How do I manage the data? They're the chatbots. How do I manage imaging data, for example? That's another one. The artificial intelligence is infused in all these things. We won't be able to live without it. It will become part of the norm, if it's not already. Data ingestion was mentioned. That's that's always the big headache. It always will be. There's been a huge shift that's taken place recently in the recognition of handwriting. That was sort of one of the last sort of obstacles. I can digitize most other data, but how do I digitize and capture and read and understand clearly handwriting data? So there's been some huge shifts in the technology there. It's probably one of the biggest shifts that you don't really hear about that's taken place over the last few years. And the other, we all know about the cloud. The cloud's everywhere, and it's a hybrid cloud. It's a multi-cloud. How do I manage all that? You won't be able to do it without artificial intelligence to make all that happen. So in summary, with a lot of the trends that we were seeing prior to COVID have now been massively accelerated. The third leg of the stool, collaboration, is being underpinned by technology. It's enabling, people to be able to do things that they couldn't previously do, and a willingness to do things. And we have to say that there's been enormous change in people's willingness to collaborate and share. There's an enormous shift that you are seeing with the FDA and the Europeans as well, EMA, in terms of their willingness to look at the new technologies and how do they incorporate. And they will have to do it because consumer demand will demand that solutions move, that these tools are absolutely utilized and that consumers are switched on. Now, one final comment, we could make lots of final comments, and that is, I just want to make a comment around, we talk about older people and their use of technology. One of the interesting things that's come out of this is everybody was worried in terms of telehealth and telemedicine, however we wanted to find it. Could people get access to it? Would they be comfortable with the tools? And the answer is, the mother of necessity, of course, is yes, they absolutely can. So we don't need to worry about older people. They are quite competent. Clearly, there are people that need some help, but in general, it works very well. So I'll stop there and I'll hand it back to Tim, and I believe Tim will open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a very different perspective. And I think with all the speakers, we had a very broad perspective on the whole topic from the clinical and regulatory perspective, data and information management, and also technology-wise. I think we have plenty of time left, about 15 minutes left for question and answers. We already have received a few questions through the Q&A window. We're going to start here. Please do not hesitate to continue adding your questions, and we'll pick it up from there. The first question probably goes to Jennifer. Are there opportunities to advance FDA support on clinical remote monitoring for devices where they weren't previously supportive of routine remote patient checkups? Are there CROs that are more familiar with this new type of trial management?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And I think that you're seeing it now. I think essentially the core concepts of telemedicine or remote monitoring are outlined in the trial guidance they issued for operating studies during the pandemic, where they quickly saw the need to have that capability, because you want to have assurance that if you have a patient that is taking an investigational drug, you can assess them for certainly safety, but efficacy. And so I do think that this is going to continue. In particular, I was at a meeting at MassBio in the middle of last year where the Deputy Commissioner of FDA, Amy Abernathy, spoke. And she said that one of her key initiatives was promoting better access to clinical trials. In particular, she was sensitive to the fact that she had heard from individuals with cancer that they were very interested in participating in trials, but the burdens of traveling to trial sites was difficult. And so she, in particular, wanted to promote telemedicine as a way in which we can diversify the participant base for clinical trials by not making the patient come to the clinic all the time. So I hope that answers that question.
Can I just add a comment? I mean, there is a huge issue that we have today in terms of, the stay-at-home environment that we're in, and the access to treatment for people with cancer. So, we know that a lot of patients that have cancer are not getting chemotherapy at the moment because they can't go to a clean site to receive their medication. So once again, that will drive the community to look for a solution to that, which will be potentially around home care or other. But I'm not suggesting that people will be getting chemotherapy at home, but there will be, it will be just one of those things that is forcing us to look for solutions to what is a massive problem at the moment. That's at the moment it's sort of being swept under the carpet.
And maybe just a short comment from my experience. At my previous company, we were exploring remote digital trials and trying to identify the opportunities for which clinical trials that a remote nurse could go and periodically check on patients. Could they have the wearables and the technology to put their daily stats like blood pressure, heart rate, and other things into the system so that can be tracked, and how can they do that in a validated way? So I think there are companies that are moving towards it and working with the agency to identify how they capture the information, validate it, get it into the system, and then care for patients. From a sponsor perspective, it widens our patient population, so we can get to patients that may not be able to come to our normal centers for clinical trials. So there's a lot of opportunity here for sure.
Thank you for your responses. The next question goes slightly in the similar direction. And I think we may start with Jennifer again, but then of course, Scott and Andrew to chime in. At the heart of FDA's review process is that information must be scientifically valid. Many of these tools may or may not be validated for their general performance, but also need to be shown to be relevant to your trial. Can you talk about how you validate these tools as being relevant to their use in your specific trials?
That's a good question. It makes me think of what Andrew said about there being a large number of devices. A Fitbit comes to mind, and I think, we've certainly, in my experience, had many discussions about, wow, isn't this cool? Isn't there a way to incorporate this into our studies to collect information? But there's many, many companies that have developed devices to do just that are in fact validated. And I can think of a company in Massachusetts in particular that makes a really interesting biomonitoring device that has 510(k) clearance. And so right there you have some greater level of regulatory, I'll say, confidence around it, in that there was some design control, and essentially it has been assessed as being able to monitor what it claims to monitor. So I think you have to think about, what device am I using, and what are the particulars around it, and might there be something that has in fact been cleared for that. And then with respect to relevance, I think it comes back to, where does it fit in the disease relative to symptoms? And I can think of a meeting that I was at a few years ago where there were representatives from the neurology division at FDA, and someone was showing data on a home monitoring device that basically uncovered information that patients spend a lot of time in bed, and they have a progressive neurological disease. And so the FDA response to that was, that's interesting, but if that's what you're saying would be an endpoint, time in bed, I'm not sure what we're measuring. Are we improving depression? Are we improving fatigue? Are we improving motor function? So it didn't really fit. So it clearly does have to be relevant. There needs to be a way to understand, is this a symptom that is meaningful to the patient and am I measuring it through that device? And so I think that has to be brought together. And then of course it has to be discussed with the agency. Like anything, I would take it to my review division to discuss what my intentions were early on in the hopes I could pilot it in early studies and get buy-in relative to the validation pathway for that measure.
I think there's no doubt that if you think about where we were a couple of years ago as we started the journey around digitization, there's a whole host of people that jumped in and were hoping to have a device or whatever that could be used in the process. But the rules are the rules, and we all have to stand by the rules regarding validation and making sure devices are properly calibrated. And I think the one comment that always resonates is always the rules are the rules, that you need to stick with them regarding validation and ensuring devices are properly calibrated. But there are tools now that meet those requirements. But if it's now an integral part of the use of digital devices. But I think there was confusion a couple of years ago, or hope I could say a couple of years ago, about devices that could be used or not used. But the regulators have been very strict about on that particular point. If data is to be used in the clinical process, it needs to be validated. It needs to be properly regulated.
Yeah, this is the big question when it comes to digital technology, is the validation question. And so last year, FDA released 2 draft guidance documents on it. So if you go to the FDA website, you can check out their thoughts. And I think they had encouraged folks to respond with comments on how you would go about validating digital technology. And one of the concerns are, if you take what AI is supposed to do, it's supposed to learn as you feed it more data, and it changes. And the crux of validation for most of us is, if I push button A in my software, I'm going to get this result. And that should happen every time. And with AI, that doesn't happen over time as it learns and as it expands. So how do you control this? And I think that's something that both industry and the regulators are going, and probably the standards organizations are going to have to talk about, is what's a pragmatic approach towards this. The other thought I have regarding validation is, we hear that Google and Apple and Microsoft and other technology companies are trying to enter the pharmaceutical market via device, via other methods, and the concept of validation isn't always there for them. It's, what can I get out to the general population to wear my Apple Watch or my Fitbit or whatever? And then how is this data usable in a clinical format? And I think those are great questions to start asking, because it's going to move us forward. And those disruptors are good for our industry to think about. How does it affect our trials, our patient health, our patient monitoring in the future?
But what's interesting is the FDA has moved very quickly recently to approve some devices, and the Apple Watch was the first one around cardio, was a very good example of that. And the number of algorithms you mentioned, learning algorithms, which are complex and to monitor and regulate, the FDA has really been at the forefront of allowing algorithms to be used in devices. So you can track those down, but there's really a remarkable up curve in that that's really quite, that I suspect, I haven't seen it recently in the last few months, that I suspect will also continue its uptick. The Europeans have been slower in that area around approving the use of algorithms in devices, medical devices.
Yeah, we won't bring up the data protection laws that may preclude that. That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, I agree. We have one last question. It's a pity that we need to kind of wrap up in a couple of minutes, and it's a pity that we can't do this this session like face to face as it was initially planned. We had more time for this kind of questions. Nevertheless, we want to stick with the time. There's one last question. I don't know, Scott or Jennifer, is that something that you wanted to quickly respond to, or Andrew, from a technology perspective? Maybe I can give a short statement from our side. The question is, considering there's now greater emphasis and need to collaborate virtually online community platforms are becoming more important. Does the data obtained from these online communities enter the equation in your jobs? And if I'm just adding a quick statement from our side, this is something that especially our colleagues from pharmacovigilance are dealing heavily with adverse event reportings on online platforms, social media, and so on. And it's kind of getting really a challenge to collect all these data sources. In many cases, it's kind of unstructured documents, texts, whatever. And that's where pharmacovigilance are already utilizing natural language processing and kind of automated monitoring of these kind of platforms in order to identify potential adverse event reports to pick them up, because that's kind of at the end the legal requirement. I know, Scott and Jennifer, something from your side you want to add?
Sure. I think, Tim, you hit on the primary use case I've seen is in pharmacovigilance with identification of safety impact from patients, whether they posted on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then how do you identify this and then follow up? A use case from regulatory that might be a little more abstract is, in the past for reg intelligence, you had certain sources, whether those were scientific journals, the pink sheet, things you relied on to gather information. And nowadays you have blogs from all sorts of people. You have financial statements. You have many other disparate sources of reg intelligence that may or may not be valid, but there's information out there. So how do we filter through all of these blogs and information, whether it's on therapeutic area or specific products, and then to synthesize those into a summary for a reg strategist to then use and consume when they're developing reg strategy, looking at our labels, looking at our promotional materials, etc. In the future. So I think that's another area where kind of that huge public domain comes into play.
Thank you, Scott. We're nearly done with the time. I still have a lot of questions on my mind, but I think they need to wait for the next time. I want to thank everyone in the panel, and also Chris and her team in the back who's supporting that and setting this all up. It was a very interesting discussion for me, and I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. I think Chris will end up with some last statements, especially about the survey afterwards and availability as a video recording of that session. I want to thank all of you for your participation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and of course, again, thank you to the panel's speakers for your interesting insights and thoughts about this topic. Thank you.
Hi, it's Chris Lindgren in the background. The recording is going to be available on our YouTube channel. We'll be sending a follow-up survey. Please answer that for us and give us any ideas for future topics. We're going to try and incorporate a little more networking in experiment in some of our future forums. So we hope you'll visit our events page and look at what we have to offer. And thanks again to the generosity of our speakers today and to our co-chairs for helping with the planning. We greatly appreciate your participating today, given the trying times that we're in. So thanks again.
Thank you all. Thanks for organizing it, Chris and Tim and Scott and Jennifer.
Have a good day, everyone, and good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Hey.
Very good job.